The elements of change, changing international political situations, changing world finances, changing commercial needs. The 1990s are a preamble for a new century of evolution on a global scale. An evolution comprising new parameters in commerce, communication, and transportation. The reintroduction of new political structures throughout Europe have created an environment conducive to a new economic union. A union that will in turn introduce a series of profound changes destined to forever alter the profile of business travel.
Some of the physical borders have already been removed. The wall is a perfect example. Hopefully the remaining walls will come down in 1992. That opens everything up for the corporate travel manager and the business person to have wide open opportunities to do business in Europe.
The basis of this new union will be reliable, efficient global business travel. Yet perhaps the weakest link in this progression of change, the evolution of the world's transportation system, may not be keeping pace with the political and social process. The successful and long-term emergence of the European economic community will depend on sweeping changes, boosting capacity in the air and on the ground. Wings of Change. International business travel in the new Europe. A united European marketplace spanning 320 million people in 12 sovereign nations will thrust striking new challenges and demands on business travel managers serving every aspect of the industry. And while globalization offers the opportunity to serve a greater portion of the world's consumers, it also introduces a new level of responsibility to logistics and future planning.
Globalization, I think, simply means that a company is going to have to think beyond the parameters of a single country. I simply think it means understanding how to do business in more of the world's countries.
Being US isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to be international, and that doesn't just mean having foreign subsidiaries, offshore subsidiaries. It means having people in headquarters who really understand how to capitalize using the strengths of the US techniques and systems and adapting them to doing business overseas.
Business travel executives serving the corporate consumer within a global economy must be fully cognizant of new technology, the benefits of enhanced travel systems, and the limitations of existing systems.
I think that we have to anticipate that there has to be the inevitability of global deals being struck with companies that operate on a global basis. And I think that this has to lead in due course to the willingness of airlines to structure global deals for companies that seek that type of arrangement.
I see opportunities for corporate travel managers to increase their knowledge. I see opportunities for them to assume different and more exciting responsibilities. I think it's going to be a real challenge for corporate travel managers, and I think any corporate travel manager who is savvy is going to be on top of this as quickly as possible. I don't see problems, I see opportunities.
And now, your host for Wings of Change, Sander Van Oker.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be, as it were, your concierge today, introducing our members of the panel, inviting questions and comments as we show you this videotape called Wings of Change. I'd like to introduce the panel. Starting at the end of the table is Jeffrey Shane, who is the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs of the Department of Transportation. To his right, William S. Watson, Vice President, Director, Strategic Marketing for the Sheraton Corporation of ITT, stationed in Boston. To his right, Norman Jackson, head of the Technical Department, International Air Transport Association from Montreal, and to my immediate left, Frederick Sorensen, head of the Air Transport Division of the European Economic Community in Brussels. I want to introduce by satellite from Paris, Daniel Tannenbaum, who's the General Director of the French Civil Aviation Authority and President of the European Civil Aviation Conference. He will be joining us by satellite from Paris. I'd like to address the first question to head off this panel discussion to Mr. Watson. Are these changes quite real in Eastern Europe? And are they as filled with difficulties as they are with opportunities?
They're extremely real, and they're extremely difficult situations to deal with. I might add a little story on behalf of Sheraton, where we spent the better part of 2 years in negotiating contracts in Moscow for 2 hotels that we signed last year. And some of the difficulties that came about were such things as the inability for the Russians to express the word debt. I'm sure they've overcome that now with the more recent events, but that little incident that took many months to resolve just perhaps describes the difficulties with which it is to get a deal off the ground there.
Mr. Tannenbaum in Paris, I'd like to ask you, sir, from the European point of view, do you see it that way too? Difficulties overcome by opportunities, or do you place the emphasis on the difficulties?
No, personally, I think there is a lot of opportunities in Europe, in West Europe, and also in East Europe. So changes are occurring in both parts of Europe, Eastern and Western. And all that give new opportunities for everybody.
From the official point of view, the government point of view, Mr. Shane, what is the outlook?
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated, Sandy, with the tension right now between this concept of globalization that we've been talking about, we've listened to people talking about in the video, in business generally, and a legal and political structure in aviation, which is the very antithesis of globalization. Even within Europe, we're talking a lot about EC92 and the coming together of the 12 member states into a single common market for aviation services. Terribly important, but what that means is nothing more than that 12 of our partners are going to be a single partner. We have something like 80 bilateral agreements between the United States and its trading partners. That number, 80, will be reduced by the fact that 12 of them are coming together to become a single market. But the basic structure of international aviation has not changed, and it is absolutely inconsistent with a globalized international economy. And the challenge for us is to figure out how in the world we take that absolutely crabbed and restrictive system of bilateral agreements and bring it into the 20th century at long last.
Are you suggesting that political change, like technological change, has outraced the capacity of governments to catch up with it?
I think technological change has outraced the capacity in a big way. The capacity of governments to modernize their own thinking about the characteristics that we have to see in the aviation market today.
When one looks at the projected growth of air travel over the next several years, the prospect that air travel, particularly international air travel, will at least double by the turn of the century, it isn't too difficult to imagine the problems that we're all going to have to face in the future.
It will certainly double. The only question is, will it be in year 2000, 2001, 2003? It's going to happen. And if there is such congestion that air transport is impeded, the effect on business and indeed the whole idea of a common market within Europe will be jeopardized.
The airways over Europe are among the most crowded skies in the world, with over 11,000 daily flights carefully marshaled into less than half the airspace of the continental United States. In 1991, a projected total of more than 400 million passengers will pass through 23 independently developed and maintained air transport systems. These systems, restricted by national borders and local interests, utilize 43 separate ATC centers. The United States directs more flights in over twice the airspace, utilizing only 20 centers.
Compared with the United States, where there's a Federal Aviation Administration in charge of all of air traffic control in the United States, we have in Europe some 43 air traffic control centers administered by some 23-odd states, all of whom have national responsibility for the air traffic control within their airspace boundaries.
The unique mosaic of European airspace represents a number of narrow corridors carefully threaded through miles of military airspace as a result of Cold War politics. The result is a further tightening of available airspace and an overabundance of military control as well.
Yes, the question of military airspace, the use of airspace in Europe by the military is really a running sore among the civil aviation community, both the private flying side as well as the airline side.
An SRI study conducted by the International Air Transport Association indicates that the number of capacity-generated delays in European airspace has doubled since 1986. More than 800,000 hours, representing the equivalent of 33,333 24-hour days, are expended each year by aircraft waiting for air traffic control. There is no available figure to indicate what this represents in fuel, salaries, and aircraft wear.
Well, the capacity problems in Europe can be summed up in really one word: delay. And delay generates additional cost for carriers, additional inconvenience for passengers, and in the final analysis will prevent the benefits of deregulation, which are planned for 1992 and beyond, to be realized.
The annual penalty to European gross national products will reach $10 billion a year by the year 2000. It is already several $billion a year in economic penalties that are being imposed because of the lack of capacity.
The Air Routes Traffic Control Center, located in Maastricht, the Netherlands, is under the direction of Eurocontrol. Though created in 1960 as a central authority for providing technical and operating expertise in air traffic control, Eurocontrol has no political or legislative authority to enforce standards or introduce improvements. The European Civil Aviation Conference, however, has recently called upon Eurocontrol for solutions to problems that have been heightened through political neglect.
And now the Eurocontrol is sold to us as the vehicle for the future. I mean, 3 decades it didn't work. What conclusion do you take out of that? Do you say it hasn't worked the last 3 decades, but since the water is now up here, it's 5 minutes to 12, I think this time it will work. So you have no guarantee.
The reality of life is that we are much better off harmonizing the centers, making them able to communicate with each other through their computers, enabling them to use each other's radar, to make them operate as though they were one.
Yes, the approaches are not mutually exclusive. I don't think there's any doubt that a single system centrally run would be ideal, because then you could really set about designing the thing on a most efficient, cost-effective basis. Europe's probably not ready for that yet. But I think history has shown that the closer people work together, the more the likelihood, ultimately, is of them making sacrifices which perhaps, like a marriage, I suppose, right at the very beginning, you're not prepared to make. And it is quite possible that this development which is taking place now could ultimately end up with the ideal system.
Experts agree that congestion in the air is a further extension of congestion on the ground. Aerial logjams are often the result of airports operating at peak capacity. The parallel runways and modular terminals of Munich II, Europe's newest airport, can accommodate 14 million passengers a year. Under construction for over 10 years, the completion of this facility was delayed for almost half that time by legal and environmental concerns. It will be the first and last new airport Europe will see well into the next century.
The only new airport to open up in these years is the new Munich airport, which will open next year. And other than that, there's no new airport planned in Europe.
The politicians, of course, have got a difficult problem, particularly as regards airports. There's nothing more politically difficult than building an airport or another runway. So we don't underestimate their problem. But we believe now that the time has come to create this constituency that can come together with a common voice to balance what has sometimes, I think, been a fairly unbalanced argument from the Green side.
I think we've got to do collectively, everybody that's at this meeting and everybody that has anything to do with this industry, do a better job of persuading governments that encouraging the growth of aviation is in our collective best interest, and we want to do it. So let's build the capacity that is needed, and let's encourage open competition around the world, and there'll be more and better airline service for everybody.
To lead off this part of the discussion, I'd like to turn to our colleague, Mr. Tenenbaum in Paris.
First of all, the situation in Europe is not worse than in the United States. One of the main reasons of the actual situation in Europe is the fact that the traffic has been flat from 79 to 85, and since this date it is increasing about 12% a year. This big change creates a lot of problems. A second point, which has not been raised before, is the fact that in Europe, population is more dense than in the US, and we have a good system of railways, and we are developing a high-speed train network in Europe. I want to add that we need to define an international regulation to phase out as soon as possible the noisy aircraft, so we can use more efficiently the existing airports, develop new runways, and permit in some areas to use this airport during night.
In the best of all possible worlds, Mr. Shane, suppose you do solve the airspace problem, the air traffic control problem. You are faced, as Mr. Crandall pointed out, with a very tough problem on building new airports. I happen to take, as an old political reporter, the Green movement very seriously.
There isn't any doubt that you're not going to get around the environmental problem. You're going to have to confront it head on. You're going to have to confront it through planning, through technology, and through a lot of very hard political work. Fact is, no national economy can afford to freeze air transportation in its place, and at the same time, no national government can afford to do anything but give its citizens the quietest possible environment around airports. That's a tremendous tension, and it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort in order to break through and provide for the future.
I think one of the things that Mr. Shane brought out is absolutely critical, this whole argument. I don't hear anybody in the airlines ever saying that we should not take care of the environment. I don't hear that, and I sit in a lot of councils. Neither do I hear anybody on the environmental lobby saying close down airlines because it causes environmental damage. The net result of this is then that what we're really talking about is what Mr. Shane says. Where do you affect the balance? It's not a question of all or nothing. It's a matter of where the balance comes.
But in terms of globalization, the arguments are the same. It's a global problem with a symmetry to it. How do you deal with it?
I think Daniel Tenenbaum referred to the importance of finding global standards for noise, for the treatment of noise at airports and the treatment of noise from airplanes. It is a global problem, because if Europe decides that it's going to kick all the noisy airplanes out and reserve its airspace for quiet airplanes, those airplanes are going to have to go someplace. They won't be scrapped.
Is Europe going to do that? The Greens are a powerful force there.
Europe, in fact, has already decided that it needs to improve its noise standards, and it's done both in the European communities and it's done in the European Civil Aviation Conference. We have, in the community, decided not to open the possibility for airlines to import anymore aircraft which do not meet the strictest noise standards. And we're going to pretty soon put forward a proposal to phase out the existing aircraft in our airlines fleets which do not meet Chapter 3 standards.
It is absolutely vital that what has happened in the last 10 to 15 years doesn't happen next. The industry is operating aircraft which are emitting 1/10 of the noise they were 10 years ago. Now, what must not happen is what has happened in the last 10 years, where immediately the investment being made to reduce the noise, houses are built closer to the airport and a new anti-constituency is developed. It's down to politicians to stop that happening locally and nationally.
ATC challenges and capacity problems will be heightened by dramatic changes in the commercial policies of the new European Economic Community. This is Heathrow Airport, the gateway to Europe and one of the continent's busiest airports. Passenger traffic here grew from 23.7 million to 29.4 million in the 8-year period between 1976 and 1984. Yet in the 3 years following the initiation of relaxed international aviation agreements, the number of passengers passing through this facility climbed to 35 million. A climax of 40 million was reached in 1990. This is a direct result of a new competitive philosophy.
The view of Europe and the consumer in Europe is that European airfares are way in excess of those in the United States, and that the United States traveler has benefited very considerably from deregulation on this side of the Atlantic, and they can't wait in Europe to have deregulation or liberalization, as we call it there, in order to see airfares fall.
1988 saw the introduction of the first liberalized transportation policies in Europe. Yet sweeping new changes planned for 1993 will essentially alter the entire European air transportation profile.
First of all, by January 1, 1993, there will be no capacity control whatsoever anymore between countries. And what will happen in the meantime, that starting from the present capacity rule, which calls for a 60-40 maximum relationship in capacity between two countries, the airlines will be allowed to increase or shift capacity in increments of 7.5% per year until the 1st of January 1993. And as I said, then there will be no capacity restrictions anymore at all. The other very important aspect is on the pricing side, where by 1993, by the 1st of January, in all of Europe, a double disapproval pricing system will be established. And that means that at that point, any airline can introduce a so-called non-predatory discount fare as long as neither country or neither government of the receiving countries objects to it, similar to the double disapproval rules which are already in effect in some of the bilateral relationships right now.
A complex system of agreements and treaties, commonly called bilaterals, form the basis of international air travel between nations today. Yet the very process by which bilateral agreements have been derived may now be giving way to a new philosophy as well.
What we hope is that eventually this bilateral negotiating process that establishes new opportunities for airlines and international aviation on an almost entirely reciprocal basis, very often being a lowest common denominator basis, can be replaced by something like a more conventional regime for the trade in aviation services, if you will. We don't have agreements of that kind for any other sector of international economic activity that I'm aware of.
Progressive business travel managers in North America will easily understand that this new philosophy in bilateral structuring will greatly shift the European Economic Community's position in the international aviation market, sending significant tremors throughout the domestic aviation market in the United States. Cabotage and fifth freedom rights will become the new buzzwords of globalization.
Fifth freedom rights are known also as beyond rights, the ability to carry passengers or cargo beyond the destination.
Cabotage is simply a term that refers to the ability of a foreign carrier to carry local domestic traffic within somebody else's territory.
Current bilaterals allow U.S. flag carriers to fly passengers between London and Paris. This represents a fifth freedom. Destinations within the same country, such as Paris and Dijon, would be cabotage and are prohibited by bilateral treaties.
When we talk about a service between London and Paris, well, normally that would be called fifth freedom. But as the community becomes one market, we do believe that, in fact, we should consider it more as cabotage.
It's a new definition of cabotage, not widely recognized in the parlance of international civil aviation, but as an economic proposition, we certainly understand what the Europeans are telling us.
The privilege of having a carrier from one nation serving another has traditionally been determined on a reciprocal value basis. Cabotage has never been an issue regarding the United States, as no European nation can offer a reciprocal value.
For example, if the Netherlands were to offer the United States cabotage rights, that's a little like offering the right to serve both East Duluth and West Duluth by air. The Netherlands is smaller than my entire congressional district. The right to take off from Amsterdam and land in Nijmegen is not a very valuable right in exchange for allowing KLM access to all of the United States.
And the particular point that is arising comes about because of the creation of the single European market from 1993 on, and what happens to non-European carriers' traffic rights thereafter. And there are really two alternative scenarios. One, which we certainly do not support, is that non-European carriers' rights should be eliminated or restricted. The other is that they should remain, they should be encouraged to fly even more. In order to achieve the latter, there would have to be a major move by the US government to permit foreign airlines, in this case particularly European airlines, to be able to fly cabotage within the United States.
The concept of the cabotage issue, however, is not consistent throughout Europe or the United States.
It may be that interests are different as well on the European side, whereas British Airways may want to have cabotage rights here for whatever they think they're worth. We, for example, at Lufthansa at the present time, see this more as a political issue in discussions in Washington than as a realistic option for us. We know that based on our operational costs, running a service on a cabotage basis here in the United States as an extension of our international service is a very, very expensive undertaking and doesn't really make economic sense for us.
But we think that we serve our customers best if we link up with a national carrier like we have done already with Continental from Newark Airport. By doing so and by having code sharing, which really makes it possible for the travel agents to get the information about the efficient traveling we can provide, we are better off than having cabotage and possibility to fly on our own into the foreign continent.
We don't really think that U.S. carriers are likely to lose any of the existing rights that they have to fly within Europe. How much of an increase there might be and how that might be exchanged for additional rights that European carriers have in the United States is I think, is the real question.
European airlines may come to rely more on commercial alliances than cabotage during the transition to a more liberalized transportation industry.
The European airlines need to reach a size, a critical mass, that makes it possible for them to be as cost efficient as the big airlines in the United States or the big Asian airlines. And to have one airline per country in Europe would be the same as if you had one airline per state in the United States. And that doesn't make sense because you won't reach a critical mass, a size that is really cost efficient and competitive, you see.
Yet while these alliances may represent a logical progression for the international transportation industry, some industry leaders have expressed reservations.
I don't think that most of the world's carriers have joined hands. This is a business legendary for its competitive ferocity. So if I join hands with you, I'm going to count my fingers when I'm through. And I suspect you are as well. And I think the same thing is true of most of the world's carriers. It is a systems business. Inevitably, the world's airlines are going to, their airplanes meet at various points. And at those points where they meet, they have natural business relationships and areas of cooperation. At the same time, those same companies will compete with one another with great ferocity on a number of other routes around the world.
Some Americans have wondered if liberalization in Europe will introduce the same mergers and acquisitions that followed in the wake of deregulation in the United States. Government control of foreign carriers, however, introduces another set of variables.
I would expect that with the growing trend toward liberalization, that more of the governments will seek to privatize and to reduce their influence and certainly their investment in what is now their flag carrier. On the other hand, these state-owned airlines, if you will, have built up very strong positions, virtual monopolies in many cases. So even when they become a private company, they will be formidable competitors because of the investment that their governments have made over a very long period of time.
The hottest areas of contention regarding the competitive issue in Europe have evolved around the development of computerized reservation systems.
It's really a question of, on the one hand, not allowing airlines to take inspiration from the dirty tricks department. And on the other hand, to make certain that we really have a fair competitive situation. So we have a certain need for harmonization technically, but we must also guard against, as I said, the dirty tricks department. One example of that is the introduction of a code of conduct for computerized reservation systems.
I share the concern of Mr. Sørensen that it's too easy for any airline who controls the system themselves to change one of the variables or one of the functions of such a system to gear traffic into their own airline.
Cross-access among global CRS is definitely coming. CRS will be seamless. You will be able to have essentially one CRS that you're going to be able to use worldwide.
As with deregulation, the driving force behind liberalization is better service and lower airfares through competition.
Mr. Tenenbaum in Paris, on the issue of new airlines, does it bode well for competition that in your country, Air France has purchased Air Inter and UTA?
Yeah, it is right. Let us see what happened in the US. 8 airlines have 94% of the domestic market. In Europe, Western Europe, we have 22 airlines for a smaller market. If the Europeans want to compete, they must be strong. They must have the appropriate size to compete with the US mega carriers. It is exactly what we are doing in France. It is not a diminishment of the competition because our system was based on the principle one route, one airline.
Mr. Shane, you mentioned, and it was an elliptical reference, about we have to pay attention to what are the Europeans telling us. Is that what the Europeans are telling us?
Well, the Europeans have seen the strength that's come into the U.S. airline industry by virtue of deregulation, by virtue of a system which has enabled the U.S. airlines to reinvent their own market. They've reinvented their own market, they've changed patterns of traffic within the United States, and they've created new gateways for international traffic in the United States. My favorite example is Charlotte, North Carolina, which has either daily or double daily service to London. Lufthansa will be starting up an operation from Frankfurt to Charlotte very shortly.
The only thing that I'm bothered by, and I don't take umbrage at it or offense, is the insistence on a national carrier in Europe.
I think that it's not so much state ownership which we have to be bothered about. It's a possibility for new airlines to come into the market alongside the state-owned airlines in order to make the whole air transport system in Europe competitive. There has been a tendency for at least some of the state-owned airlines to be feeling too secure, so they have allowed their cost basis to increase. And well, it's the system which you had in the States in the old time before deregulation. You had a cost plus pricing, and we've seen that in Europe from some airlines. It's that system which we are trying to weaken. In fact, it's that system which we want to abolish.
Mr. Watson, as you sit and listen to all this, and you have to make forward strategic planning for Sheraton, what do? Do you follow what the airlines decide to do? Do you now have to go into Charlotte if you weren't there before?
The hotels have tended to be followers of airlines, and to some extent we are captives of that. Over 70% as an industry of our traffic comes from airlines, is delivered to us by airlines, so we have to be in the right places, and it's a matter of trying to plot that through. The other area that perhaps I'd just like to touch on in the competitive area is the comments on the reservation systems and the seamless CRS's, central reservation systems. That's an area where the hotel industry has tended to follow, but is taking some forward moves now. I happen to head up a group of some 17 hotel chains, all of whom are dire competitors, all of whom count their fingers every time we walk out of the room, and I happen to have 10 left, in which we're developing a platform, a technological platform, to allow our rooms to be accessed directly via a switching company from the airline reservation systems.
Let me just ask, Mr. Shane, without giving offense to our European colleagues, either here or on the satellite, I have to say that in Washington, in the Congress, and in the administration, there's some suspicion now about whether the European market that was coming into being in 1992 is going to be protectionist and adversarial to U.S. products. Is that felt also in the area of airlines?
Let me speak personally. I don't think I can speak for the Congress. I don't happen to think, and I'm not sure very many people in the Congress think, that it is one of the moving forces within Europe to try to create barriers to the entry of American business, including American business in the aviation industry. Europe is thinking about itself, as indeed it should be. And I think that it's a bit of a conceit on the part of Americans to think that they're really worried about the extent to which Americans can continue to participate in the market over there. Our job as observers right now in what's happening in Europe is to ensure that inadvertently the European community does not accidentally create those barriers, because that would redound to our detriment, and it would redound to the detriment of the European economy.
Nothing's done inadvertently in Brussels, is it? It's not that kind of a town.
No, I don't think that anything is done inadvertently, and in fact, I don't think that we're going to make it more difficult for U.S. airlines to do business in Europe or to and from Europe. That's not the way which we are developing the common market. In all other areas, we have always taken into account the companies which are already there and allowed them to continue to expand. And I think that's going to be the same thing in aviation as well.
We come down almost to the end of this session, and I'm struck by the constant theme, international cooperation. Yet I hear slicing across it competition, not in the normal sense, not in the tough brass knuckle sense that Robert Crandall talked about, but inevitable sovereignty competition. Is this going to be a problem, Mr. Jackson?
I believe, like Jeffrey says, that nation states act in their own best interest.
They don't do it for any other people's interest. They do it because they feel that's right. The US will do that. The nation states of Europe will do that. They will do it individually and collectively. Plus the fact that everything is interdependent now. We not only have globalization of business, we have globalization of this great international industry of ours.
The understanding of globalization as a new philosophy in business transportation management will be essential to the successful emergence of the European economic community and the enhancement of both domestic and international travel in the United States. Progressive organizations like the National Business Travel Association and its 49 regional affiliates realize that globalization will have a substantial impact on our national economy, existing levels of service, and the development of future services. Now is the time to assess the full implications of globalization, its challenges, its pitfalls, and its advantages. All of this must be carefully studied before we can ascend on the wings of change.